September 27 is the first anniversary of the Second Artsakh War. During those 44 days of war and the post-war period, the international media has been actively covering the regional developments. Today I will talk to the war journalist, reporter from New Zealand, Tom Mutch, who has been covering the last war in Artsakh. Good day, Tom. Thanks for joining us.
Good day, and thank you very much for inviting me here.
Tom, how long have you been in journalism, and particularly in covering conflicts and military actions?
So I am actually not that old of a journalist. I've only been covering these sort of events for about the last 3 years. I covered conflicts and refugee crises in South America, including Colombia and Venezuela. And also when I worked in the British Parliament as a defence researcher, I covered the conflict in Ukraine. However, I have to say that the war in Artsakh was definitely the most intense military action I've covered this far in my career.
Tom, how and when did you decide to come to Artsakh? What were your thoughts on your way to the conflict zone?
So I didn't end up coming to Armenia or to Artsakh until about halfway through the war. I was on another project and I didn't end up getting there until about mid-October. But I remember that the journey to the conflict zone from Yerevan to Stepanakert was one of the most heart-pounding and harrowing experiences I ever had. I remember that even on the way, as soon as we crossed the border between Armenia and Artsakh, we could just hear shelling all around us. There was explosions going off in the mountains. Whenever we passed soldiers, they would look frightened and scared, and we'd talk to them and they'd be talking about how the aggression had moved closer and closer to population centers, to important military outposts. I remember at one point, my driver even stopped the car and he said, oh my God, that explosion. They're not meant to be so close yet. In the end, I literally had to put my arm on him and say, it's okay, man, we're just going to get to Stepanakert and then we're going to be fine. But it was a very, very harrowing experience. And I think all journalists who crossed through the Lachin corridor at that time had a similar kind of feeling.
Tom, what was your experience? What's it like to cover the Nagorno-Karabakh conflict? In which territories have you been during the war?
So as I think I mentioned before, this was, in terms of the intensity of the fighting, probably one of the most intense conflicts that anyone that I know has covered. I was there with journalists who had been very experienced, who had covered wars in the Balkans, who had covered, the conflicts in Iraq and Syria. And they all said that in terms of, the actual intensity of the fighting, this was probably the most intense thing they had ever experienced. I didn't go all around Artsakh. I spent most of my time in Stepanakert. I also went near Shushi, but by the time we got near Shushi, unfortunately, the town was under too intense shell fire and we couldn't enter. I also spent some time in Maternity as well, which, right next to the front line, which was probably the most intense scene of the fighting. Now, it can be covering these kind of wars. You go through a whole spectrum of emotions. You go from being terrified to being exhilarated that that you've survived and that you've managed to cover something so important. And to be honest, sometimes you can even just feel like a little bit bored. On one day in particular, I was in my hotel pretty much all day because the air raid siren above us was just constantly going, and we couldn't even leave the property. And I kind of remark on this to a lot of fellow journalists or a lot of people who have survived conflict, is that when the first shell or explosion you hear goes off near you, you absolutely freak out. But the 20th or 30th or 50th time it happens, you just kind of get used to it and you feel that life goes on.
Tom, how long did you stay in Artsakh? Can you tell us some incidents of those days, like the one you have included in your article? You've been telling that your driver, whom you even called Michael Schumacher, was driving with a speed of 150 kilometers per hour to escape drones.
Okay, so in total, it's been about 2.5 weeks in Artsakh. Half of that was during the war itself, and the other half of that was visiting a couple of times after the conflict. So that particular experience I'm telling you about was probably one of the most, some of the most intense action that any of us in the van, because I was in a van on a press trip with about 4 or 5 other journalists had ever had. We had been in Maternity examining the damage of Azeri drones and shelling, when at some point our minder, the Armenian soldier who was with us, basically said to us, look, we can hear drones above us. We've got reports of incoming drones. We need to get out of here as soon as we can. And we sort of hightailed it back to our van. And, we started driving out the van and we're going down that road. If anyone has gone down that road from Stepanakert to Martini, you probably know that there is a quite large billboard of Monte Melkonian on the way there. Is celebrating his exploits in the First War. And I remember we were very, very close to that. I think we'd either just passed it or we were just in front of it, when all of a sudden, we think it must have been an artillery shell or something, exploded probably just about 30 meters to the left of our car. We got hit a little bit by the shockwave, and our driver just started screaming something in Russian and then just slammed his foot on the accelerator and started going absolutely as fast as he could down the road back to Stepanakert. It's quite a narrow road and he was driving extremely fast. The reason we called him Michael Schumacher was kind of a joke, because he's kept on driving at that sort of speed well after the explosions had stopped, well after we were out of danger. So we kind of secretly felt that he kind of enjoyed getting the chance to do this, not that we blamed him or anything.
And Tom, you have authored an article with an Armenian journalist about 5 displaced people from Artsakh. What was the most striking story or episode you've heard during those conversations?
Yes. And thanks, of course, to Avetis for his help with this article. Rather than one particular story, what actually I came across was the fact that in all of those stories, what was quite heartbreaking was how that these people had grown up and lived not just through a single war, but through a series of wars and a series of refugee crises. I remember there was one woman who, after the initial anti-Armenian, pogroms, moved to, I believe it was Tajikistan, but I don't want to say that in case it was one of the Central Asian states, I think Tajikistan. And there had been a wave of anti-Armenian sentiment there when the refugees from Artsakh and Armenians then living in Azerbaijan started moving over. And so she was then forced back to Armenia. And there were other cases where, you talk to children and they had grown up, with the knowledge that a war could break out. When they had been younger, they'd lived through the short 2016 conflict. It was just about how these people had been refugees or victims of conflict over and over again in their lives. And it had sort of become something that, as I said, while still terrible for them, they had accepted as part of normal everyday life, that war and being displaced, they just come to accept that as part of their normal lives. And I just kind of felt that that's something I wouldn't really wish on anybody. If I have one small anecdote, it's not from that article. I do remember there was another young man that I interviewed who was a Syrian Armenian, who I wrote about in a later piece. And he had fought in Syria, been injured several times, and then he had moved to Armenia. And shortly after being in Armenia, he had signed up to go and fight in Artsakh and been injured again. Again, war had just become an ordinary part of life there.
Tom, and in one of your publications, you wrote that the day before you arrived, people even staged a wedding in a damaged church in Shushi. And then you described that, along with the sound of explosions, you remember that it was the deadliest war, the world's deadliest war. How was it to be in the middle of life, hope, faith, and blood, and at the same time pain of the existing reality?
So one thing that I felt that did give me some quite heart, and that I admired about the people in Artsakh, is that they still kept their pride in trying to continue the good and normal parts of life as well as they possibly can. That included things like staging a wedding, but it also included much smaller things. For instance, I would notice that every day at about 6 or 7 o'clock in the morning, you would have people sweeping the streets of glass. They would be, taping up all of the windows and everything like that. And that I kind of noticed they were trying to, because Hanukkah usually is it's a very clean and kind of quite beautiful city. And that what they were trying to do was that they were trying to keep the appearance of their city as nice as possibly could under the circumstances. And I was like, even in such difficult times, they were still trying to keep pride in where they lived and how they lived and how they appeared to themselves and to the outside world.
Tom, you were in Artsakh when Azerbaijan targeted the maternal and child healthcare center and some public and residential objects. Do you remember how you reacted, and how is it to realize that one of the conflict sites targets pregnant women and newly born babies, no matter if they were at the center right at that moment or not?
So on one hand, I do have to say that we obviously met civilians there, but by the time I had gotten there, the vast majority of civilians all throughout Artsakh had been evacuated to mainland Armenia. However, one of the points of targeting civilian infrastructure is not just to necessarily kill people who are there, because as far as we know, I don't think anyone died in the strike on the maternity ward. Maybe I think someone might have been injured. But the point is to make the places unlivable for people to come back. And the other point of targeting civilian infrastructure is to make the point that people will not be safe if they come back to these regions, that anything outside of military objectives can also be a target. Obviously, this was a very harrowing thing to say. I would be amiss if I didn't say that, look, we have to be honest that civilians are always casualties in war, and civilians were killed on both sides of the conflict. But what seemed to me about Azerbaijan's actions was that they were trying to make it impossible for people to come back by damaging the infrastructure so much.
Tom, journalists were also targeted by Azerbaijan during the war, and several of them were even wounded. In this context, what difficulties did you face? I'm sure you've also been in danger.
So, as I said, I had actually written an article about this that's due to be published on the anniversary. It was about my experience in Maternity I just told you about. It's due to be published in about a couple of weeks. And what we noticed that happened a lot is a lot of journalists. There was the first strike where the journalists from Le Monde were injured. There was another one in Shushi where some Russian journalists were injured. One thing we noticed is that almost every journalist who was there has some story of a very near miss. And we couldn't help but think, because obviously there was a slight international pushback when the French journalists were injured, but so many journalists came very, very close to being hit that what we felt is that they were almost toying with us. Like, they knew there were journalists there and they knew there'd be an outcry if they hit us and killed anyone, so that they would strike as close to us as they possibly could, because the weapons they had were very, very, they were very precise modern technology, very targeted weapons. And that what we felt is that they were trying to give us warning shots, stay here for any longer and the next shot will hit you. That's why a lot of us, after we talked about our experience in Maternity, felt that, that if they had wanted to hit us and kill us, they probably could have.
Tom, and it seems that the involvement of the terrorists and the role of Turkey also affected the balance of power and the outcome of the war. How is your audience's reaction to this war overall? Because it was also called the fifth generation warfare of new technologies and drones.
So one interesting thing that I think is happening is I don't just write for a kind of civilian audience. I will write in more technical publications for a military audience. And one thing that is happening now is that a lot of Western militaries, the United States, and particularly the United Kingdom, are drawing a lot of lessons from what happened in the Karabakh, in the Artsakh War. And one of the things that's happening is that we now know that if someone doesn't have the proper air defense technologies in place, and that they can just be absolutely wiped over by those kind of drones. And we've seen drones used to similar sort of effect, especially those Turkish-made drones being used to change the tides of war in northwest Syria and also in Libya as well. So what people call this a fifth generation war because, as one of the soldiers on the ground was telling me, it feels like the other side are playing a video game. They're sitting in command centers whether it's in Baku or in Ankara or wherever, and using these drones while we're fighting on the ground. It was like they just don't fight fair. And yeah, it's true, they don't necessarily fight fair, but the fact that they were able to sort of push over the Armenian army in the war does mean that some lessons need to be learned about the importance of investing in these sort of short-range anti-drone, anti-UAV missile systems.
Tom, despite the ceasefire, Azerbaijan still continues its anti-Armenian sentiment. The military trophy park opened in Baku was a clear demonstration of that policy. How is such behavior perceived by the international community and particularly by the people and authorities in your country?
Well, I mean, I thought seeing the military theme park was one of the most grotesque and disgusting things I'd ever seen in my life. It's very common to have war memorials all over the world, but war memorials are supposed to celebrate the sacrifice and the heroism of your own troops. They're not supposed to be about dehumanizing an enemy. I do have to point out one thing that I found slightly disappointing in the general reaction to the war was, unfortunately, the war happened at a very inopportune moment, which was it happened when the second wave of COVID-19 pandemic was picking up, and also happened right before the US presidential election. So a lot of international media's attention was focused on other issues rather than the Artsakh conflict. The people I have spoken to, one sentiment that I've come across is that it seems that Azerbaijan has this single-minded focus where its national identity is almost predicated on being anti-Armenian, on trying to dehumanize Armenians as much as plausible, which is also why they continue to deny the genocide, which the US has now accepted as a legitimate genocide, and which I think all historians agree on. And again, they've continued on by saying that places like Yerevan should be Azeri historical lands, and as far as I can see, I think Western policymakers are quite concerned now that they may try and, push into other parts of Armenian territories. Although I don't want to say that I know that for sure, because I haven't spoken with, the necessary high-level Western officials about this issue.
Tom, I know that you're also a cultural journalist. Yes, you wrote about Dadivank as one of the examples of Armenian church architecture. You wrote about the feelings of people, how they left the holy place, and how can you describe the feelings of those people who were forced to say goodbye to their precious places?
Yes, I interviewed Father Hovhannes. I hope I'm saying that name right. And actually, I was very struck by how he seemed like a man who had sort of borne his cross with a lot of respect and a lot of dignity. It was obviously very, very heartbreaking to see, people forced to leave a very, very ancient place of worship. And yeah, there are 2 points I'd like to make here. One is that in conflicts like this, so I'm currently doing some work. I'm in Belgrade right now in Serbia. I'm currently doing some work in the Balkans about the sort of very late after effects of the wars that happened in Bosnia and Croatia, and briefly here. And one thing that opposite sides do to each other, particularly when they're of opposing religious groups, is that they will try and destroy important cultural and religious significance. And the idea that they want to do is to make it so that not only the people who have inhabited these lands for a long time don't live here anymore, but that there's no trace of their cultural identity or heritage anymore, which is why you have, senior Azerbaijani officials denying that Dadivank was ever an Armenian church, for example. The other thing that I wanted to point out is that I did return to Dadivank A couple of months later, I went under the escort of Russian peacekeepers. It was a very, very eerie and very, very strange experience because we get there and the whole place, I don't know if anyone's been to Dadivan since, the whole place has basically been turned into a Russian military base. It was very, very strange to see. You've got this beautiful ancient historical church. We were on a day there where it was snowing it had snowed all around. You had beautiful blue skies and the sun out. But there are Azeri army everywhere, Russian army everywhere. The Azeri army are kept fairly far back. We saw a couple of them come to the canteen. And on the ramparts of this ancient church, you've got gun turrets and you've got sandbags and you've got and you've got APC or armored vehicle emplacements. This kind of contrast between sort of the beauty of the place we were in and the sort of the tension and the military equipment really did kind of summarize the conflict and sort of the beauty and the tragedy of war in one place, in one scene.
And many people who visit Armenia always talk about that unique hospitality and friendly attitude. How were you welcomed in Artsakh, even amid the bombs? What memories did Artsakh people leave in your mind?
Look, as I said earlier, I was very impressed by the resilience and the honesty and the courage of people in Artsakh. And, wherever you would go, you would be offered, as much food as you could eat, as much wine as you could drink. And even within this kind of very, very difficult situation, they still kept a good sense of humor. They still kept a very sort of positive and as optimistic a mindset as you could given the situation. And as I said, I made friends there and I had experiences and met people there that I'll never forget.
So in the past, Armenians saw genocide and an attempt of ethnic cleansing, and centuries later we again witnessed war crimes and an attempt of ethnic cleansing, this time in Artsakh. What were your thoughts after seeing such a cruel war and aggression against humanity in the 21st century?
Well, I think one of the things that we were quite disappointed to see. So I keep on coming back to the example of the Balkans because, as I said, I'm a fairly young journalist. This is the first example of this sort of conflict that I've ever seen. I thought I had covered conflicts in the past. When I got to Artsakh, I realized that no, I hadn't actually. This was the real thing, and for a lot of people. A lot of journalists went to Bosnia and Croatia in the 1990s, a lot of my much older colleagues, and that's where they had their first experience of seeing very, very savage conflict. And in a way, you always have this sort of faith that all of these sort of crimes happened in the past, but we're now, in a much more civilized era and these things shouldn't be happening anymore. And when you see it for the first time, it realizes, well, actually, no, there are some very, very, very evil things that can happen in the world. They're still happening now, and if the right action isn't taken, they could easily happen again. And that's why I actually think it's very important. A lot of people were saying that the acknowledgement of the Armenian genocide was just a historical dispute. For the US, it wasn't worth angering a neighbor like Turkey. But no, I think it's because it is very important to recognize it as a legitimate genocide, because by doing that, if you don't legitimize that, you open the door for these sort of things to happen again in the future, and then for the existence of those crimes to be denied again. It's the denial of previous crimes that allows new crimes to occur.
Tom, and are you planning to visit Armenia again? Maybe you have new ideas, new projects?
Actually, yes. I'm hoping to visit for the one-year anniversary of the announcement of the ceasefire. In November, I want to do a project about how the war has changed the lives of people in Armenia. And, I want to visit the border areas where there are still firefights and aggression by Azerbaijan. As I said, we would all international journalists very much like to visit Artsakh, but as I said, we have been consistently denied access, and no one has ever been able to give us a reason why.
Thanks for the interview, Tom.
No problem. It was an absolute pleasure, and God bless and best of luck.
Thank you. Today I was talking to the war reporter from New Zealand, Tom Mutch, who has been covering the last war in Artsakh. Thanks for watching us.